Wonderful to be with you all tonight. It's always a pleasure to have this opportunity to get together and explore some things. So I thought what we could do first, before we try to talk about silence, a bit of an oxymoron, but we'll see how that works out. I thought we could just check in and see. There's a sense of being here, being present. So by being present, I really mean allowing ourselves just to drop into the state of awareness, just to allow whatever arises within that space to arise, and sort of relinquish our judgmental mind, analytical mind, tendency to conceptualize things, let go of stories that we might have been bringing into this moment. They'll probably still be there afterwards if they are, but for the next little bit tonight, we can just sort of set those aside. They'll be there if they need to be later on, but we don't need to carry them with us into these next few moments. So we can also let go of any hopes that we may be entertaining that somehow the next moment will be an improvement over this moment. Things will change, of course. We'll have preferences, okay? That expectation of things being somehow different in the future better, of course. And just let that tendency go. You know, just see it as a tendency of the mind to want something better, something other than whatever this moment happens to have. If there's some issue that we've been struggling with, maybe something that sort of grabbed our mental processes and sort of just keeps churning away inside of our minds, we can also just let that rest for a while. And just, maybe just as an exercise, we could just see if that grip doesn't loosen when we're not fighting it so much. And we just let it be. It may still be there, but we can see that there's something more possible in these moments, just to experience our sheer aliveness, let's say, our sheer just beingness. So we can all just sense into that, just that sense of being here, wherever you are, being present. Finding yourself in the environment that you may be in at this moment. Sort of sensing into your relationship to that environment, being in the room. Feeling the familiarity of the room, being supported by the air in the room, the warmth or the coolness. And we can notice as we're just sitting here that certain sensations may arise, maybe the sensation of breath, the movement of the body with the breath, maybe even the sense of welcoming the breath into the body, being grateful for it, allowing it to be returned to the room. Sense of being grateful for being comfortable or somewhat comfortable in the chair that you may happen to be sitting in. You may also notice that there might be feelings that arise within the body. And we can allow them to be there, just see them as arisings within this awareness. In the same way, we might have thoughts that are arising as we're listening to someone on Zoom droning away. We can allow those thoughts to be there as well, without having to take up the managerial role to improve them, change them, have the right set of thoughts. We can just see them as arisings within awareness, comings and goings within this field of consciousness, without having to do anything about them. So whatever may draw our attention, maybe it's a bodily sensation, maybe a slight discomfort or tension in the body, maybe the sensation of being a bit hungry or a bit too full from having just eaten, whatever. We can just notice these as the body's ability to sense into its surroundings as well as its own body. It's what it's good at. So we can allow it to be that sensing organism. And at the same time, notice that there's the sensing, sort of understanding of what that sensing means, and there's something that notices that sensation, notices that interpretation of the sensation, notices the next thought, notices the next feeling, whatever. So we can also see that the thoughts come and go, the feelings come and go, bodily sensations. We may pay attention to one minute and forget all about the next. But what's constant is this awareness of whatever it is that arises. So in that sense, this awareness has solidity to it, right? It's not subject to comings and goings. It's present for whatever arises. You know, it's formless. We can't make it into a thing. We can't stand back and look at it simply because it is what is looking. We also can't conceptualize it. It's not subject to that. but we can experience it. We can experience it as our true nature. So the invitation, the suggestion is really to devote ourselves to that awareness. That awareness prior to any content that may arise within it. So that awareness isn't dependent on having the right thought. It's not dependent on resolving whatever issue we might be struggling with. It's actually not even dependent on whether we may be feeling more or less healthy, tired or not. Awareness is still present for all of it. So the invitation is really to come back to that often, to see that ground of our own being that is ever present already. Something that we don't actually need to create. It's already present. We just need to stop and notice, remember, return to that spacious awareness. Okay, everybody here? So what I thought we could talk tonight about is silence. I had to look up the definition of silence, and I mean there are a number of definitions, but the closest one that was even at all relevant was the absence of noise. So I don't know about you, but that to me just felt like sort of a roundabout definition where we're defining something by its apparent opposite. You know, silence is the opposite of noise, or the absence of noise. But I mean, does that feel sufficient to you? I mean, it didn't to me. You know, it felt like a easy way out. So I think there's several ways we can look at silence. I mean, the most common one, I suppose, is when we think about silence, we think about silent spaces, you know, where we can be in an environment where it's quiet. You know, perhaps the room that you're sitting in now, or perhaps when you might have gone for a walk this morning, or, you know, times when we've spent out in nature where it's just been really still. This could be an exterior silence. And I think for probably nearly all of us, that's a pleasant experience. It might be new, you know, if we've lived in a city for a long time and suddenly there's an absence of man-made sounds. It can be a little disconcerting. I mean, I remember the first time I traveled down to see a friend in really, really rural West Virginia, you know, where the nearest farmhouse was a mile away. It was so quiet. It was really different, and it took me a couple of days for my ears to stop ringing from the absence of noise. But I think for most of us, the experience of sort of walking in nature is soothing. It's soothing in some ways as a reminder of maybe an earlier time maybe an ancestral time, perhaps, where things were quieter. It's interesting that it's when we're walking, say an airplane flies by, we take that to be a disturbance of the silence, of this exterior silence. But if the leaves rustle in the trees, or the bird sings, or the sound of the stream gurgles down the hillside, we don't seem to mind that. I mean, that's okay. We don't see that really as a disturbance of this external silence. So it's almost the way it's usually felt, I would say, is having to do with man-made sounds, just being able to get away from that. So this is external silence. It's helpful to sort of help attune our own bodies and hopefully even our minds to some extent to a deeper sense of silence. It can be conducive in that way to spending quiet time with ourselves, and maybe discovering something more silent within ourselves. Okay, so there's also internal silence. Internal silence is different than not talking, right? We can say, well, that person's being silent. Well, they may not be talking, but inside their head, if they've got an issue going on or a problem that's been unresolved, or still replaying a story that they wish turned out otherwise, there might be just a volcano of things happening within their head. They may not be speaking, but by any reasonable definition, we couldn't say that that person is silent. They may not be talking, but from an internal perspective, it's not silent at all, right? So we can easily discover that, and probably most of us have had that experience where we, maybe first started to sit down to meditate and may become quite shocked at the degree of noise that is being generated internally, through thoughts, through feelings, and then it gets amped up even more when we believe that meditation shouldn't look like that, so we try to stop it, and that confuses things even more. But being internally silent, we can experience that, and we all do. We may not pay that much attention to it because it may just be a fleeting moment. When we're meditating, it may appear, and it usually is like this for maybe quite some time, just one thought and another, then another, with not even, a hair's breadth of daylight between them, just one after another, in a linear fashion, sort of like a freight train. And you're sitting at the intersection watching them, one car after another go by, endlessly. Well, endlessly for 30 or 40 minutes anyway. But perhaps it may not happen right away, but perhaps with some sort of consistent willingness to sit in that space, in that quiet space, we may begin to notice just the slightest gap between thoughts occasionally. May not last more than a split second. And when we do notice it, the mind is quick to come in and say, finally, you're getting this meditation thing right, congratulations, which is of course more thought. But it also happens at other times in our life. If we're, suddenly, we're driving, we, come over the top of the mountain and there's the sunrise just in incredible, glorious colors spread, all across the horizon, and there might be just a split second of awe, maybe even 1 or 2 seconds, before the mind comes in and, says to the person next to you, what a beautiful sunrise, right? So, that moment where our mind is sort of put into neutral by a sense of awe, where the visual just overwhelmed the mental capacity to take it in. Mind stops for just a moment, and then quickly comes back into, regain control and characterize it as beautiful. That encompasses the entire experience. The word beautiful encompasses that. Or it might happen when we're, maybe, well, out in our garden, we have some black garden hoses that are just about the same diameter as black snakes, which we also have. And, every once in a while you see this black round thing in the grass, and, if you might just jump out of the way or take extra caution till you see what's actually there. I mean, not that black snakes will hurt you, but still a surprise. You probably don't want to step on it. And so just in that moment, just this, again, a split second of, sort of shock. And then the mind comes back and, oh, it's just the garden hose. Okay. But we've all, whether, I mean, it might be a joke also, where our mind is just stunned into silence for a split second by an unexpected punchline. Well, these experiences are things that we all have. We tend to disregard them because in those moments where the mind stops, there's not much to say about it. Because we've for an instant, we've lost the content, and we've stepped back into just the awareness, you could say. Okay, so we've all had these moments of inner stillness, and when we're meditating and those moments happen, maybe even for an extended period, maybe for a few minutes, maybe for longer, those become highly valued. I'm achieving peace of mind. Okay, good. Okay, so this is inner stillness. But we define that inner stillness in terms of the absence of thought. So in some ways, it's still dependent on thought. It's sort of the dual opposite of thought. We have thinking, and then we have moments of silence. And then we have more thinking. But that's what we typically call inner stillness. But I suggest that there's an even deeper level of silence that is probably what's really important. And that deeper level is the recognition of the silence that's present even while thinking is happening. Because thinking may be happening, but again, as we talked about earlier, that awareness is present for that thinking. That awareness is silent. That awareness is willing, perfectly willing, to allow thought to happen if it's happening. Also doesn't mind if it's not happening. It actually doesn't have a preference. Our mind might, but the awareness itself will be present for thinking. It'll be present for not thinking. But when we're thinking, our minds have been trained to focus on external things, the little sparkly things that draw our attention, the exciting things. Awareness, well, it's there all the time. Silence is there all the time. We can ignore those. But thought, that's interesting. So our mind tends to get pulled back into thought again and again, until someday we might find out that ultimate truth won't be found there. In the meantime, ultimate truth is already fully present. That's the good news. Already fully present, witnessing our attempts to find it. We don't know it's doing that, but that's actually what's happening. Okay, so those are like three ways we can typically look at silence. The exterior silence when we're walking in a quiet place, interior silence when our mind might briefly stop for a moment or two. And then there's the recognition of the silence that's present, even while there's external noise, even while there's thought happening. That's the deeper silence. Okay, so silence itself, we come back again to this definition. Is silence really the absence of noise? Or would it be more true to say that silence exists? And noise is sort of the exception. It comes and goes. But silence, forests grow in silence. Galaxies come and go in silence. Fish swim in silence. And sometimes sound happens, right? Sound requires energy to produce, right? The energy of speaking. You cut down a tree and it makes a noise. You walk on gravel using energy to do that. It makes a crunching sound. Hit a nail with a hammer, it makes a sound. All those things require energy to generate a sound for which has a limited lifespan, right? So you could almost say that there's silence, and then a sound is generated from that silence, has a certain lifespan, and then subsides back into that silence. Maybe if you're standing in the Swiss Alps and yodel or do something, that sound may carry on for a bit longer than your normal voice does, but it still has a beginning, a lifespan, and then drops back into that silence. So in that way, you could say that the silence is primary and the sound is the arising from that silence. So if we imagine, let's say there was, what those emergency broadcast signals are, that really annoying tone that interrupts the radio show and, goes on for about 2 minutes or so. And it's just a single monotone. So if you could imagine some sound that didn't vary in pitch or amplitude or anything, just went on and on forever and ever and ever. It would still be, in some ways it would still be sound, but our bodies would eventually just tune that out. It would just be background. It would, it would have no interest because it wasn't variable. It was just so constant that we just ignore it. It's really only because that the sounds that we hear have a variability, like a speaking voice or music, or if it's just monotone, we just ignore it. It's just like if everything that we ever saw was exactly the same shade of blue, our eyes wouldn't see blue. It would just be something that we'd ignore. In that same way, the silence itself tends to be ignored because it's always present. We don't have to manufacture it, right? Like on this Zoom talk tonight, you can hear the voice, but we didn't have to set up special equipment, so there would be silence between the words, right? That's just sort of a given. It's there. We don't have to create it. Okay, another interesting aspect of silence is that let's imagine that you're in a music studio and everything's quiet, nobody's there, and then let's say a heavy metals band comes in and just blasts the place wide open for the next hour. Just, okay, the end of the hour, they pack up their gear, move out. Was silence disturbed by that? Was silence somehow diminished by that hour-long incessant noise or music, whatever your tastes are? Was it somehow lessened by that? Sort of the same question as, if we're considering the open sky, does, a cloud floating by diminish the spaciousness of the sky? It's actually the same question as, from the point of view of spacious awareness, does a thought moving through our consciousness diminish that awareness? So if we, let's say there's, let's consider like Japanese flute music. It's just really, really sparse. Lots of silence in there. Very few, very sparse notes being played, very simply. And it's almost as if the notes are pointing back to the silence. Just sort of accentuating the silence. If it was just a recording of silence, our minds would tend to get bored with that pretty quickly. But there's just enough tones, notes that it almost refers us back to that silence again. So in that way, there's this interplay happening between sound and silence. We can't really say that the silence is opposed to the sound, or that the sound is opposed to the silence. They really, in some ways, point to the possibility of the other. In other words, the silence holds the potential for all sounds to arise. Just to look at it from a slightly different perspective, in quantum mechanics, there is a well-accepted viewpoint these days among those kinds of scientists that that what is fundamental is like a field, an undifferentiated field out of which, when energy is introduced at a certain point, then there is like a concentration of energy at that point, and the manifestation is something within the manifest world, something that changes the potential for something to arise into the actual arising of it. So very much like sound arising from silence, there's this field, like an electromagnetic field, that under certain circumstances, at a certain location with a certain probability, that a subatomic particle may arise. Before that, it was just the potential to arise. And then out of that, there's an actual arising. So they're finding out that there's this really interesting interplay between form and then dropping back into the formless field. So very much like silence in a way, where a particular energy is required to generate a sound that has a certain lifespan, drops back into the potential for sound that we call silence. There's another concept from another field also that's related here also, and that's out of the field of mathematics, concept of the number zero. We had numbers for counting like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 long before the concept of zero was introduced. I mean, it was the first place it was introduced was in the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and it was sort of a placeholder. You know, if you had a list of, I don't know, fruit, and you were selling them, and you know there were 4 of these and 3 of those and 2 of those, but that day you didn't have any, say, melons. You put this little symbol saying, you know, you didn't just forget to put in a number, there just weren't any that day. So it's sort of a placeholder that people understood that, you know, you didn't just leave out a number by accident. You know, that was maybe 500 BCE or so. Then the concept traveled to China. They sort of, you know, added a little more sophistication with it. Came back to the Muslim culture in like 700 current era. But the interesting thing about it was, even though there was trade between East and West in 700 current era, that concept never caught on in Western Europe for another 500 years. And my sense of it is that the concept of the reality of a null point, of something prior to the manifestation of things, was something that the Eastern meditative mind was comfortable with, and something that, you know, Westerners in that time, you know, for 500 years, weren't really comfortable with that. It's, you know, they were so focused on the external, you know, they could count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but the idea of something having a property but not existing was just not something that the Western mind at that time could wrap their head around. And maybe still today, there's some of that still lingering on, where even in current Western psychology, a lot of it's still about, you know, even when, you know, there's looking within it or inner psychology, it's still about sort of improving that inner landscape. And the idea of looking at something that, you know, within which all of that's happening, like awareness or consciousness, whatever we want to call it, is still a sort of a fringe idea in you know, among a lot of Western psychologists. That's changing, but that's been pretty much the tradition for the last 100 years, maybe up until the last 20 years or so. It's gradually admitting the possibility, well, maybe there's something to this meditation. So, but for the Eastern mind, you know, for 500, 1,000 years before that, there was a tradition of contemplation of inner silence. You know, the willingness to allow ourselves to go beyond the limitation of thought, which is really what meditation is in its simplest way we can characterize it. It's about really settling in to let ourselves drop down into the silence that's present even while thought may be happening. You know, to focus on the witnessing of thought rather than the thought itself. You know, to step back from the thingness that appears within consciousness and place our attention, you could say, more on the consciousness itself. Okay, so I wanted to, in Zen, they talk about 10 characteristics of awareness. But it's also equally true for silence. So we'll talk about it in terms of these characteristics, you could say, of silence. Okay, so one aspect of silence is that it's unbounded. Right? It's not subject to the limitations of our, whatever way we may have to think about it. Whatever we think about it, whatever sounds we make, somehow silence is bigger than that. You know, there's no way we can step out beyond the bounds of silence and look at it. Right? The reason for that is that what is looking is silent. So what's being looked at can never be bigger, more expansive than what is looking at it. Okay, another aspect is that it's always present. You know, it's not going anywhere. You know, we may say, well, it's being disturbed by this sound or that sound. Maybe we like the sound, you know, that's music that I like. Okay, great. You know, maybe it's, you know, someone using the lawnmower on Sunday morning. We don't like that. But even while those sounds are happening, pleasant, unpleasant, whatever, in our own judgment, that silence is still present. It's still present as that awareness that notices all of the sounds. We could also say that it's choiceless. It doesn't have an opinion about liking this sound over that sound. You know, in awareness, we call it choiceless awareness. That awareness that's present for whatever it is that is arising. But silence is also the same. It is willing to receive, you could say, or provide the ground for whatever sound is produced by however it's being produced. Man-made, nature sounds, actually doesn't have a preference at all. It's willing to, say, support all of that. It's also big, right? Immense, bigger than any concept that we could have about it. You know, there's no way we can see the limit of it. There's no way we can put it in a box. It's also non-conceptual. You know, we can't really, you know, even though I made some effort to do that tonight, we can't really create a concept about it. You know, we can sort of talk around the fringes of it, but the silence itself isn't subject to whatever conceptualizations that we may try to make about it in our mind. Any conceptualizations about silence will fall short of silence. Any conceptualizations will be based on thought, which is actually a form of sound or noise within the field of silence. It's an arising, and it's an energetic arising within a field of silence. Limited lifespan, requires energy to generate, ultimately will fall back into that silence. So whatever thought is being generated is not it, right? It's not subject to whatever conceptualization we may try to put it in. Okay, it's that silence is also untainted by noise, right? We talked about the heavy metal band, but in some ways it's similar to, let's say we're in a movie theater and they were playing some horror movie, you know, just blood and whatever all over the screen. You know, 2 hours later, movie ends, they turn the lights on, screen is fine. You know, the screen wasn't tainted by whatever the content that was projected onto it was. You know, very, you know, in that way, very similar to silence, right? Whatever sound was generated, it still leaves that silence untainted, unharmed, unmoved. Okay, this silence is also stable, right? It's not subject to having to create it. It doesn't come and go. You know, we may talk about it as if it went somewhere in the presence of noise, but if we really catch on to it, we see that that silence is a necessary element of whatever sounds, whatever thoughts may arise within it. You know, so it has that stability to it, even though it is, you could say, ephemeral, you know, formless. Still has a very solid, stable presence in that nothing can disturb it, nothing can dislodge it, right? Okay, silence also doesn't have a particular point of origin. It doesn't require anything to be created. You know, it doesn't require a specific set of conditions to exist. It's sort of a pre-existing condition, right? Pre-existing, that way very similar to awareness. The awareness is already present. You know, we don't have to manufacture it, we don't have to create it. It's only an assumption that it's created here but not there. So when we really look at that silence, it's you can't say that that deep underlying silence is more present here than there. It's just doesn't have a point of origin, right? So it's just present. Okay, but you could also say that silence also isn't not, you know, it isn't nothing, right? It's not sort of a dead, inert silence. When we really feel into it, we can begin to sense the potential of it, the potential of that silence to accommodate, receive, be the counterpoint of whatever movement, whatever energetic manifestation there is within that field. And the last aspect is that it's really ungraspable, right? You know, you can't take silence and put it in a jar and take it somewhere and open a jar when you get home from vacation and say, oh yeah, that silence is still there. You know, it's just, you know, any attempt to grasp it, to reduce it to something that, you know, we can use for our own benefit is, it's just so completely subject to failure. Okay, so if this silence is to be expressed, what does that look like? You know, in sort of common usage, there's this term, you know, if someone's sort of a skilled speaker, skilled orator, there's this term, well, he's silver-tongued, right? He can, you know, express concepts really well. And then there's this term, silence is golden. But there's also a way that silence can be expressed. It can even be expressed through words. In some traditions, they call this, you know, golden talk. You know, words that come out of that silence rather than come out of, you know, conceptual, mental, regurgitated kinds of talking. So sometimes things can be expressed in a way that points back to the silence, back to the awareness, even though the words are, you know, arising, okay? But then there's a deeper silence there as well. You know, we could take this as, you know, if someone is singing, you can tell whether the person is singing out of their head, you know, just trying real hard to, you know, do it right, you know, not to embarrass themselves, you know, being self-conscious about it. Or, you know, if it's coming from sort of a deeper place of expression where it's just, you know, it's just a flow, it's just an outpouring. You know, sure, you know, there may be some training involved beforehand, but when one's actually fully in that, the presence of that, we could call it silence again, that somehow out of that silence there is an inspiration to express something that may not otherwise be expressible in a way, you know, that really expresses that love, that joy, that exuberance. You know, it's really like, you know, bringing from something beyond ourselves, beyond our mental ability to control, you know, allowing something beyond ourselves to flow through this body-mind in a way that's expressive of the silence, even though it's you could say utilizing this body-mind. You know, you could call that authentic singing. You know, in that moment, in that particular moment, it may be an expression of that. You know, the next moment, that same person might be doing something else. That's fine too. But it's really, in some ways, allowing ourselves to get out of our own way. You know, to get out of that tendency to continually self-reflect about how am I doing now? You know, am I doing it right? Am I talking from ego now, or am I talking from a more awake space? You know, that continual sense of self-reflection actually is ego, right? It is, you know, our mental capacity intruding on something that can be free-flowing, that can come from silence, arise from silence, be an expression of silence. And that you could call, you know, authentic singing. It could be in other areas as well, where we, you know, step out of the way, you know, allow ourselves to get past the limitations of our own mental thought process. Okay, there's a freedom in that. So we've been talking about this as, you know, from the perspective of silence, but it's also really not only related, it's really the same thing as talking from awareness, right? Where the recognition is of the awareness rather than the content of awareness. So in very similar ways, I mean, that like silence, that awareness is undisturbed by thought, much like silence is undisturbed by whatever sound arises within it. Like silence, awareness is also present without our having to manufacture it, without our having to attain it. You know, it doesn't come and go. Our attention may come and go, may become fascinated with this or that, and we forget all about the awareness that is noticing those arisings. But the awareness itself doesn't come and go. There's a stability to it, there's a solidity to it, even though it's formless. We can also notice that, like silence, it doesn't have a point of origin. You know, we may for a while, when we first encounter it, assume that the point of origin is in our heads. That's what we were taught. But we might find out that that's not actually true. You know, that the awareness is something that we aren't personally creating. It's something that we are. That's the good news. We don't have to create it because we're that already. Okay, so the journey is actually just to recognize what we already are. That's actually the coming home. We may look everywhere else first. We may spend 20, 30, 40 years doing it, but what we come back to is what was there all along, which was the awareness, which is silent, that was always present. It was watching our entire journey. With maybe you could almost, you know, if you wanted to give it a little personality, you could say it was sort of curious, intrigued, entertained even. You know, while we go in all sorts of pursuits here and there, everywhere we can think of, before we're finally willing to come back to what we were all along. That's the whole journey, right? So in that way, the awareness, silence, not really two separate things. The awareness is already silent. Silence, you could say, is already aware.